welcome to Fraudible, the video podcast that brings together academics and practitioners and to discuss all things fraud. In this episode, we're going to be discussing food fraud, and I'm joined by academic Selca Tufan and practitioner Karen Constable. Thank you for joining me, ladies. Karen, would you mind giving us a brief introduction into you and your work?
Yes, so Claire, hello everyone. I am a food scientist by training. I began my food career working in product development and quality assurance, and got into food safety around more than 15 years ago now. So I've been in food safety since. And around about the time of the big horse meat scandal that was sort of Europe-wide, I became interested in food fraud, and I started a side business that required me to learn everything that I could possibly learn about food fraud, and I was just completely hooked on the topic, and I now have that as my full-time job. So the main thing that I do is helping food companies, so big food manufacturers typically, protect themselves from buying fraudulent ingredients. So I help them build food fraud programs. I help them to make their staff and their suppliers and their customers aware about the issues around food fraud. I help them understand which of the things that they're buying might be the most vulnerable to food fraud, and then I help them create mitigation plans and pass their food safety audits, which are now looking for food fraud as well. So that's me, and my company is Food Fraud Advisors, and we have tools and templates and training for food professionals.
Amazing, excellent, thank you very much. Selca, over to you.
I'm Seljan. I'm a bar student at City. I'm also doing my LLM. Fraud has been a passion of mine for a long time, but I've recently discovered food fraud. It's such an intricate thing, and there's so many things that go into this. I mean, I've recently found out that people are doing olive oil fraud, and that's what started my whole journey into looking into food fraud.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much. So I think for our viewers and listeners, I think that food fraud is a fairly unknown topic. I think that when people think about fraud, naturally they think about financial institutions mainly, and all the crimes that sort of link to those. But am I right in thinking that food fraud is falsifying ingredients, whether that be knowingly or unknowingly, or is it broader than that? Almost by definition, a fraud has to be done knowingly. So in a food supply chain, though, there might be a bad actor at the beginning of the supply chain, maybe at the farm gate, and then the company that maybe sells the food that you buy is committing fraud unknowingly, but the fraud was done purposely in the beginning. It shows up in heaps of different ways. So the way that it shows up that is the most scary for food safety professionals like me is if a product or an ingredient actually has something dangerous added to it. Like if you were to add a cancerous textile dye to a spice to make it look a brighter colour, which does happen quite often, then that is a food fraud. So the colour is made to look brighter so that the person selling the spice can get more money. But the colorant can be really dangerous, and we're right in the middle of a huge problem with lead colorant in cinnamon in the US actually right now, with millions and millions of packs of product affected. That's one way that it shows up. And then there's other ways that it shows up where the food isn't really involved at all. So the food itself hasn't been tampered with, and then the fraud looks like something like an olive oil that says it's virgin, extra virgin, but it isn't extra virgin. It's just ordinary olive oil, or it's actually sunflower oil with green colour in it. Sorry, that would be a different type. But yeah, so where people are saying the wrong type of thing. Organic fraud is massive. It's the third biggest type of fraud, we think, because it's hard to get data. So if you're buying your organic potatoes from the markets, there's a likelihood that they weren't grown in an organic way. It just says organic. So that's another way it shows up. And then a third way is it's totally skipped my mind right now, and I can't even think of what I was going to say. But I guess there's frauds where the food is affected directly, and there's frauds where the food isn't affected directly, and then there's frauds on the periphery where people will fake lab results, for example, and they'll say, oh, you know, that cheese doesn't have salmonella in it, and that's a false lab report. So there's sort of, I guess, periphery, and particularly around importing and exporting foods across borders, you can say false things about it so that you can avoid tariffs and taxes and that kind of thing.
Yeah. So it can basically happen anywhere along the food journey, essentially.
Yes.
Wow, terrifying. Okay. Seljan, and tell me more about the olive oil food fraud that got you into this in the first place.
So sitting down with my mum, and I saw that we don't actually have an actual olive oil brand. It's just sort of olive oil in a bottle. And I asked her why there is, and she said that there's so many counter olive oils going on. And apparently I read a statistic that 65% of olive oils that are in the UK market, they struggle to find the origin of where the olive came from. And that's because when it goes through so many borders, there's an issue of looking down who's handling it, if the olive oil got swapped. It's such a lucrative business that gives us to doing. I don't think that made sense.
I lost you, Selcan. Would you be able to...
Shall I redo that? I'm so sorry, I'm getting some feedback.
That's all right, don't worry. Yeah, if you're able and to redo that, that'll be great, because you're getting kind of blurry and...
Yeah, the connection bit sketchy.
Yeah.
Let me try and do this now. So when I got home, I was cooking something. I realised that our olive oil isn't in a normal bottle, it's in a plastic bottle. And I asked my mum why it's in a plastic bottle, and she said because olive oil is a product that's frequently been mislabeled. You know, it says extra virgin olive oil. It's not. That's what started my whole passion for it. And there's been instances where it's been diluted with cheap oils that can cause benefits. And this not only cheats the cost, but it all harms the genuine producers, and it undetermines the product's quality.
Yeah. Okay, so I guess where does the regulator sit? Where does legislation lie with regards to tackling the problem then? I
mean, the UK was taking a serious look onto food fraud. Several laws and regulations in place to these guides. The Food Safety Prime 1999 provides a foundation for food safety and hygiene, including measures against food fraud, but there isn't a very big section on it. However, there are all agencies like the Food Standards Agency, which play a crucial role in enforcing these laws alongside authorities such as the National Food Fraud Crime Unit, the I believe their abbreviation is the NFCU, and the FSA. They focus on combating food fraud as a whole. They have intelligence, they support criminal investigations and work with other, not only national, but international agencies as well. The Youth Food Fraud Network, despite Brexit and the continuing agreement that they have, they're still able to track down these fraudsters because it's such a lucrative business. I believe that it's in the billions, not millions, when it's a food fraud.
Karen, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so the United Kingdom suffered really, really badly with the horse meat scandal. Although it's not very well known in the US, it was a really big deal in the United Kingdom, and they really took some action based on the findings when they sort of dissected that. And they've got their National Food Crime Unit, they've got food fraud hotlines. In fact, one just opened for Northern Ireland in the past month. The FSA puts more attention onto food fraud than many other countries. Europe's got a food fraud sort of arm in the Food Safety Agency, but many other countries, like, for example, Australia, we really don't have any separate body that is separately tasked with looking after food fraud. Having said that, pretty much every country in the world has already got a legal framework that makes food fraud illegal. And that is because food fraud by its very nature is fraud. So any sort of rules about trading and contract law covers food fraud. Any food fraud that makes food unsafe makes the perpetrator in breach of food safety laws. And there are various other laws. For example, in the United States, there are laws around how the organic certification is allowed to work. And so if you do a fake organic certification in the US, then that's also a legal problem. They have a misbranding law in the US that also covers those sorts of claim frauds. So all around the world, there's not many places like the United Kingdom that's got a special food crime unit, but every legal framework all around the place has the means to say that food fraud is illegal. What is really, really lacking everywhere is enforcement, because enforcing food crime is really, really difficult, because the agencies that you normally enforce fraud, they don't know how food supply chains work, and that's part of the problem. And then, of course, they have to figure out where their resources go, and people tend to think of food crime as quite benign and victimless compared to other types of crimes. But even the process of investigating, if you're a policeman and you go into an orange juice factory and someone shows you, and this is a real story, and someone shows you a secret door in the wall where they've got secret tanks or vats of sugar or something like that they were pretending that they weren't putting in the orange juice. If you're an ordinary police officer, you don't know what you're seeing, and how do you prosecute that, and how do you sort of understand what all the paperwork is about and everything? So the enforcement is the challenge. The legal frameworks are mostly relatively okay.
Recently, there's been some technology that's been turning around to actually help food fraud. Got blockchain technology where they're to track down the original where things come from, such as fishing. That's such a big area of misleading fish, and it's more of an expensive type of fish when it's not. I mean, this doesn't just deceive the customer; it also has an impact on the environment. And endangered species could be overfished, and it poses such serious health risks and economic damage, as someone might be allergic to a certain type of fish that's been caught and it's been sold onto them.
So with regards to enforcement then, so what are the punishments that are carried with this then? Are there prison sentences? Are there fines? Are there elements of not being able to do business anymore? What's the sort of consequences that people might face if they're caught?
Not very much.
Oh, definitely.
But Selca, you talk.
There's massive fines going around, because it isn't individuals necessarily doing this. Majority of the time it is big corporations, so fines are something that they receive. Prison sentence, I think, is something that should start fostering. However, it's very unlikely, rare, that someone actually gets a prison sentence unless something major has happened, as in if someone has an allergic reaction and they become really ill. Only those sort of cases that we see prison sentences, most of the time it goes undetected, so it's really hard to prosecute these people. It goes through multiple borders, and there might be one dodgy man in between who's changed shipment, and it's very hard to prosecute. Karen, have you worked or seen anyone get prosecuted for fraud?
I didn't quite catch the last thing that you said there, sorry.
Karen, have you seen anyone who's been prosecuted for?
Well, actually, in your country, just last month, they sentenced two people from Two Sisters, a big poultry processing, I think poultry or meat processor, and they gave them prison sentences for their role in a food fraud thing. But I think the prison sentence ended up being, can't remember the word for it, where they don't actually have to go to prison. They sort of sentence them and then they have to, I can't remember the word for it. So that was just last month. And those two people, they worked at Two Sisters. Claire, you're nodding like you know this story. You might know it better than I do. Do you know it?
It's new to me.
I know a bit, but not...
Oh, okay.
Not a huge amount, so...
Well, my intention was, as I was talking to you guys, I have another device behind me, and I was going to actually Google so I could get the facts exactly right. I would normally really, my audience loves to hear very specific, correct facts. But because I'm on this potentially unstable internet, I can't do that. But anyway, there's two people at Two Sisters hatched up this deal with so that they were the meat processing plant. They hatched up a deal with a company that was going to buy some meat from them. They shipped, I think it was, oh gosh, I hope I've got this correct. I think it was 84 shipments of processed meat went to their friend at this other company, or their associate at this other company, and they got paid money into their own personal accounts for this. I think it was £200,000 worth of meat. And then they went back into the computer systems at Two Sisters and removed all trace of the sale. So it makes you wonder where the mass balance was working at the processing place. But they're the people who just got sentenced just last month for that role. And I think the person who's receiving the meat also received some sort of legal punishment as well. I think prison. There's a guy in the US who had got 28 years in prison for his role. It wasn't wasn't what we would normally call a food fraud thing, but he worked at a big peanut processing company, and they had a known history of sanitation problems that led to salmonella contamination in the peanuts that they were shipping out, and they were selling it to all kinds of big confectionery companies and big breakfast cereal companies and all kinds of really big brands. So it was in thousands and thousands of products, this contaminated peanuts. And what this guy kept doing, and his associates at the company, they just kept faking the lab reports and then and switching labs and pretending that they hadn't tested and basically hiding these food safety problems. They sickened hundreds and hundreds of people. 9 people died, and he's now in jail, which is fantastic. But it's really, really rare for someone to do jail time. And compared to shipping cocaine, doing olive oil fraud on a big scale, which a lot of them do, it's way more profitable and you don't go to jail. So, it's an easy crime. They're much better than cocaine, apparently.
I find that really interesting, that it's easier to commit fraud on olive oil than it is drugs. I find that completely mind-blowing.
It's pretty scary, isn't it?
It really is. It really, really is.
If you do get caught, you might just get a small fine or 2 years, but not actually have to go to prison. So
So
it's a shame.
So in that instance, then, was the prison sentence lengthened because essentially it moved from food fraud into like manslaughter, homicide type crime? Is that why it was so much longer than it would have been otherwise?
I'm not sure that there were charges brought against those people related to the deaths. I think from memory the charges were really brought in relation to the fraud, but people died, so the sentencing was quite harsh.
Interesting. Seljan, can you tell me more about the regulatory side and the frameworks as well? Because in financial institutions, you're supposed to have best practice, which is like regulatory frameworks in place to keep people in checks. Is that something that's also in place in food companies and manufacturers and the like?
Yes, absolutely. But as well as the law is advancing, technology is advancing as well. I've heard of DNA barcoding, isotopic analysis, blockchains, and there are just so many tools that are being for the authentication of product and the traceability. And these technologies not only verify the origin, they also verify the integrity of the product, making it hard for fraudsters to actually operate. And the legal landscape is going beyond the Food Safety Act 1990, and mainly the National Food Crime are taking initiatives like food hygiene rating schemes to help inform their customers of the place they're buying their food from, and the Global Food Safety Initiative. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, Interpol Operation Orson play a critical role in fostering collaboration to fight against food fraud. I found this quite interesting because when we look at food fraud, I never really considered alcohol to ever be counterfeited because you think it's such a regulated and monitored thing. However, in 2012, the Czech Republic had an incident where they actually had I think it was methanol poisoning outbreak where they actually counterfeited alcohol, and loads, I think over 50 people died and loads of people unfortunately hospitalized, and some permanent injuries like blindness and brain injuries. And the authorities traced the outbreak to a small network of distributors added methanol to increase their profit margins, and it then led on to a temporary ban of liquor sales above 20% of alcohol in any drink that you had.
Okay, so it isn't just food then; it's beverages too, I guess.
Yeah, that's right. I think the methanol thing is every single month there will be a news story from somewhere in the world that sounds just like that, and lots of deaths. And that's where people are making moonshine liquor as well, because if you don't make it correctly, you can accidentally create methanol in there too. But some of the very expensive wines and the very expensive whiskies and vodkas are also faked as well. So they make their bottle look exactly like the expensive bottle, and then they sell it.
So I guess then if you're in a supermarket, say, or in a shop, and as a consumer you're picking up a product, there's no real way to tell if it's been tampered with, is there really? If you're just taking it off the shelf, you can't test it in the shop. So is it almost too late after it hits the shelves?
Yeah, in the mainstream media, you often see news stories, or you'll see commentators talking about it saying, oh, look, just to stop yourself getting food fraud, just, don't buy food if it's too cheap, and yada, yada, yada. Yeah. Ask the people in the restaurant what sort of fish it was. And really, honestly, and particularly in manufactured foods, complex foods, there just isn't a way for a consumer to tell. The really good thing now is that within big food manufacturers, there are quite strong, they're not regulatory, but they're voluntary frameworks that the manufacturers have to have in place to be able to sell to the big food supermarket chains. So in the United States, United Kingdom particularly, where you've got your big, very strong food chains like your Tesco's and your Marks and Spencer's, they have set up these voluntary standards that are now used all around the world. And as part of that, I think, Selca, you mentioned the GFSI, the Global Food Safety Initiative. They make a benchmark for these standards, and the standards all require the food manufacturers to have a food fraud prevention framework in place. It's not perfect, but it is better. And so if you're buying food from one of your big supermarket chains, they typically have quite a good awareness of food fraud, and they're quite careful with what they buy and what they put on the shelves. So it's less likely to find fraudulent food in those big chains, and particularly in their own brands, because they're very protective of their own brands. Where we were seeing the fraud with cinnamon recently in the United States, it was in the Dollar Tree stores, the small independent discount chains, where they don't, maybe, I don't know, but where they might have less interest in the oversight of the supply chains. The big brands are working really hard to protect their own brands, and that's supermarkets and big brands of foods like, I'm trying to think of a big brand that you would know, but they're much more aware of it, and they're much more likely to protect their brands. Whereas if you go into a restaurant and somebody's just put some white fish on your plate, very much harder for you to know what you're getting
Yeah, I do think that you're 100% right, but also I don't know if you remember that from 2011, where Spanish authorities actually uncovered a network of fake saffron that was actually a spice dyed to mimic the appearance of saffron, and was Spain, funnily enough, this is the largest producers of saffron. And the counterfeit from wasn't sold domestically, but it was also sold internationally, which
Seldon,
I'm so sorry to say then.
Sorry, Seldon, you're going to have to do that again. Sorry.
So there was a case in Spain, which is one of the producers of saffron in 2011. The Spanish authorities uncovered a network of fake saffron that was actually made from cheaper spice dyed to saffron. And counterfeit saffron, it wasn't just sold domestically in Spain, but it was also exported around the world, damaging the reputation of Spanish saffron on the international market. I think it's just sophisticated how some of these operations behind spice fraud, they can elaborate processes, making the fake product appear so real that people can't even detect it. I think food fraud also, it comes from making packaging and branding, especially from Spanish cakes that we had. It was actually copied reputable saffron packaging and things, so you could tell the difference between the two.
Scary.
So typically if somebody goes out and surveys spices like saffron, cinnamon, pepper, any of them, it's normal to find 10 to 20% of their samples to be not pure and to be adulterated in a way that appears to be fraudulent. So in fact, the FSA in the UK just released some results, I think last month, where they did a survey. They were looking for undeclared allergens and other food safety things, but they also found oregano spice or herb. There was quite a lot of the samples had quite a lot of olive leaf instead of oregano in them. So yeah, across spices and saffron, if you went and sampled saffron, at least 10% of every sample that you get from everywhere is going to be faked in some way or adulterated.
But is that just accepted as the norm, and that there isn't really anyone out there panicking about that? Is that just sort of the what's expected in the industry now, and so therefore sort of it becomes normalized to an extent if people expect that?
No, the food industry is really, really upset and really, really worried about it. So your big food manufacturers, your big food manufacturing brands like Nestle and PepsiCo, they are being so careful with what they're doing with spices. The big spice brands, the big international spice brands who've got their own brands, they actually literally send people out to farms in Sri Lanka to make sure that they go to Vietnam and they look at the pepper farm and they see what people are doing there. And the reason that they're really worried about it is because oftentimes when adulteration happens in spices, it can be really dangerous stuff. So we've seen lead chromate in cinnamon, lead chromate in turmeric, and people actually getting lead poisoning. There was a very big bunch of recalls that cost a lot of food companies a lot of money from Sudan dyes, which are carcinogenic, and they were in chili powder and paprika powder. We're still seeing that in some parts of the world. And, there was a case of black pepper where they faked the black pepper by putting powder from a battery in there, like manganese or something. So people are really properly worried about that. And I think consumers would be more worried if they understood how risky it can be.
Yeah. Okay, so Seljan, what does the future of food fraud look like?
I think the future is actually looking really, really bright. I mean, there's so many new technologies that come in, and there's so many new laws being implemented, and people are starting, I think the consumer is more aware of some of the things that are actually happening. So they know some of the signs that they're maybe looking out for. Some people go and they get meat, they go down to butchers to ensure food is actually organic. People are going down to the farmers market. And especially with honey, I think there was such a big problem with honey not being real. I think in 2010, America had a real big problem with, instead of it being honey, it was 15%, and the others high sugar, corn syrup, and just sugary substitutes for honey. But they actually left an NMR, which stands for nuclear magnetic resonance, and it's a very scientific process. I'm not sure about the ins and outs of it, but they detect the presence of foreign sugars to prevent any fraud in the honey sector, and this helps to enforce certain standards in more stringent. So at every point for olive oil, there has to be a check to see the quantity that's coming in, the quality that's coming in, what tree it was from. I mean, Turkey trees now have the barcodes on them to make it more of a stringent journey into the UK.
Karen?
I'm maybe a little bit less optimistic than Selca, because there's so many different ways that the fraudsters can profit, unfortunately, and even just in tiny little low-tech ways. There's a lot of ways for them to change what they're doing. It's hard to keep on top of it, but what I'm really positive about is that people within the food industry who've got the power to actually change things are much more aware now than they were 10 years ago, much more aware, and they're much more likely to take it seriously, and their procurement teams are now properly paying attention, and they're the people who need to protect the consumers. So that's what I'm really excited about, is that we are learning how to understand the risks and to mitigate the risks from food fraud at that sort of industry-wide level, and sharing intelligence between different food companies. There is a framework to do that now, which we didn't have before, where we can share information in a semi-anonymized way, so that if you see a problem with the supplier, you can, in an anonymous way, let your competitor companies also know about the problems. And so that sort of intelligence sharing is really, really powerful. So I'm really happy and excited about that.
Amazing, thank you so much. Well, that is all that we have time for on this episode of Fraudible. I'd like to thank Seljan and Karen for joining me today and to talk about food fraud. Thank you, ladies. My name's Claire Maillet, and this is Fraudible.